First off, welcome. Thank you for joining us. My name is Amy Brady, and I'm Orion's Executive Director and Publisher. I am so excited for today's conversation, and my Orion colleagues and I are even more thrilled to be collaborating on this event with American Rivers. American Rivers is a nonprofit organization that champions a national effort to protect and restore all rivers from remote mountain streams to urban waterways. And American Rivers is also the generous sponsor of our summer issue, which we are celebrating today. I can't imagine a more perfect partner on this issue because this summer issue examines the history and present day experience of flooding, not only to protect ourselves against floods, but to relearn how we might coexist among them. If you love today's conversation, then you will love Orion. I'm sure many of you who are here are already familiar with the magazine, but in case you aren't, Orion has for more than 40 years published essays, poems, and art about the mysterious ways in which humans connect with their environments, the more than human world, and each other. The magazine is now printed on 100% recycled paper made from post-consumer waste. And to celebrate this landmark in our publishing history, to celebrate our new summer issue, and to thank all of you for being here, I'd like to offer you a 20% discount on a one-year subscription to Orion, which if you order today, will begin with the summer issue. And you can get that offer by clicking on the link in the chat box. There you are. And that discount is going to be good until this Sunday, so please use it soon. Our sponsor, American Rivers, also has a thank you for you. By joining us today, they'd like to offer you a free one-year membership to American Rivers, and you can sign up for that by clicking on the link in the chat. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our guest this afternoon. We have a sparkling lineup. Please help me welcome LACY JOHNSON, a Houston-based professor, curator, activist, and author of The Reckonings and The Other Side, both of which were National Book Critics Circle Award finalists, and the book Trespasses. She is editor with the designer Cheryl Beckett on More City Than Water, a Houston Flood Atlas. She teaches creative nonfiction at Rice University, and she's the founding director of the Houston Flood Museum. Also, and to my mind, this might be the most important aspect of LACY's bio, she's also a contributing editor for Orion magazine. And you can purchase LACY's essay collection, The Reckoning, by clicking on that link in the chat. Also joining us is ROSANNA XIA, an environmental reporter for the Los Angeles Times, where she specializes in stories about the coast and ocean. She was a Pulitzer Prize finalist in 2020 for explanatory reporting, and her work has been anthologized in the Best American Science and Nature Writing series. Her award-winning book, California Against the Sea, has been praised as a poetic and revelatory exploration of how we relate to the natural world. And you can purchase that book by clicking on this link. And joining us from American Rivers today is KRISTAN CULBERT, an Associate Director of Conservation at American Rivers. In this role, KRISTAN helps lead the organization's efforts to restore urban creeks and floodplains in California's Bay Area and Central Valley. With expertise at the nexus of environmental justice and science-based environmental conservation, KRISTAN works closely with community leaders, governmental agencies, and nonprofits to advance equity in river conservation. And if you'd like to learn more about American Rivers and their efforts, you can click on the link in the chat. So with that, let's jump in because I know I am very eager to hear from our panelists today. Folks, to get us started, I want to begin by reciting the epigraph in the summer issue. It's a quote by the great American novelist Toni Morrison, who once wrote this: "All water has a perfect memory and is forever trying to get back to where it was." My first question is to you, Rosanna and Lacey, as contributors to this issue. In both of your essays, you write about water seeking to return to places where humans have been trying desperately to keep it away. In researching these places and in other writing that you've done on water and flooding, what do you wish more people knew about humanity's attempt to control water?
I guess I will start. Yeah, and thank you, Amy. It's really inspiring to be having this conversation with all of you today. I love the Orion community, and I've been a fan for so long. And just all the pieces in this issue on floods and our relationship to water just hit me in so many emotional and profound ways. And so, I mean, to answer your question, I mean, the essay that I wrote explores this idea of like the lines in the sand that we've drawn against the Pacific Ocean, the largest body of water on this entire planet. And I think, the one thing I'll just start by saying is just so many people today still think of the coast as static, as this fixed line in the sand and a place that doesn't move, a place to visit and to recreate. And I was guilty of this when I first moved to California and took the beach for granted, but in reality, the coast is a dynamic process that is always changing. If you stand on the beach and watch the tide line as the waves crash ashore, it is never the same twice. But then, for me, I stand in LA and I look around and there's Pacific Coast Highway, there's the rows and rows of homes, and just all the ways we have tried to impose permanence onto a space that is inherently meant to be impermanent. And that, to me, is at the heart of so many of the conflicts that we're facing along the coast in terms of what it means to face sea level rise. And, yeah, we've just really, and Lacey really writes beautifully about this with the bayous in her piece, but, we've become blinded to the fact that the shoreline is this living, dynamic, moving edge between land and sea, and that there is this constant give and take between land and sea, now all accelerated by climate change. And, here we are still trying to hold the line against the most massive body of water on this planet.
Thanks, Rosanna. That's fantastic and captures, I think, so much of what I've been thinking about as well. Just, I'm writing in a different context about Houston and about freshwater bayous and wetlands and swamps, essentially. But I think that one of the issues is still the same, is that the way that we have built this city and the way that we live here relies on sort of creating structures around the bayous so that they do not change, so that they are permanent and unchanging, that they sort of flow in a very specific stream at a very specific level. And that is just not the way that water works. And especially in a place like Houston, as I write in the essay, where bayous are living beings. They're living, they're changing, they need to swell and grow. But the way that we have developed in this city and altered the land, which functions also as a sponge to hold water, and made it increasingly impervious to water by paving it, by plowing up prairie grass, by draining wetlands, that these things together have really created catastrophic consequences, and increasingly catastrophic as time goes on. The other thing that I think I wanted people to know is that that there is an opportunity to change, that we're not, our sort of future is not settled. And there's a lot of work happening here. And I know with American Rivers, the work that y'all do is that, to sort of repair and heal those waterways, to sort of allow them to have some of that movement capacity to sort of grow and swell and flood, and to make them more natural again, I guess.
Thank you. Thank you both for those brilliant insights. Kristen, given your range of expertise, I want to bring you into this conversation as well. And also ask you specifically about your work at American Rivers, whose website says saving rivers isn't a choice, it's survival. Can you talk more about what saving a river means in this context, and what does survival mean?
Sure. Well, first off, before I answer the question, thank you for just, partnering with us on this issue and allowing us to participate in this event. And Rosanna and Lacey, it's such an honor to be on this panel with you both. Amy, to answer your question, it's because life depends on rivers. It's not just our motto, it is a way of life for many people across the country, from people who are of tribal heritage, so I'm thinking within the Klamath River Basin, who literally depend on the migration of salmon in the Klamath River to sustain their culture, their foodways, and to other communities in our state that depend on fisheries to be healthy and survive for economic survival. Rivers are an engine. Rivers are the lifeblood for all of us. Um, and yeah. And would you mind, sorry, repeating your second question?
Oh, well, I think you're doing a beautiful job of answering it. What survival means when you say that it's saving rivers isn't a choice, it's survival.
Mhm. Yes. Well, yes, it literally is survival. Within the Central Valley of California, where I do a lot of my work, we depend on rivers to replenish our groundwater, so that our communities have water to drink, and to sustain agriculture. Much of our agriculture actually in the Central Valley, which does feed much of the United States, it literally depends on rivers having room to flood and to replenish these kind of underground sponges or seas, if you will, where we can draw drinking water and water for watering our crops and sustaining ourselves and our cities. And it's literally something that we all depend on. And finally, it personally for me, and I think I speak for a lot of people, it sustains our souls. It is this important source of memory and renewal and hope for many communities, including those here in California, that look to rivers as a place of hope and renewing our spirit when things are just difficult.
So beautifully put. Thank you. Kristen, I want to stay with you for just a moment, if you don't mind, because you've shared with me before that as part of your work at American Rivers, you and your colleagues look at rivers through a lens of environmental and social justice.
Mhm.
Would you share a bit more about that?
Sure, absolutely. So I'll speak to my work specifically in the Central Valley and in the Bay Area. So my colleagues and I who work in the California region with our work concentrated primarily in the Sacramento and San Joaquin valleys and in the Delta, we really look at um, trying to do things like initiate new projects and new community partnerships where we can start by planting a seed for revitalizing rivers and urban creeks and streams, by making sure that we're listening to the communities that have been historically disenfranchised the most. So, for example, within the Central Valley, particularly within the San Joaquin uh, Basin, San Joaquin Valley, um, we know that there have been people of color, specifically immigrant communities, Latino and Latinx immigrant communities that have been impacted by environmental injustice. And these injustices are ongoing. That injustice looks like things like I mean, frankly, cities running out of drinking water because of overdraws from drinking water wells, to the lack of green space and outdoor access for communities who otherwise would not have a place to go and enjoy rivers and streams and creeks, and frankly, a place to cool off during our extremely hot 105-degree summers. So that's something that we are working on at American Rivers, where we're trying to work with disenfranchised communities and work with Indigenous communities and BIPOC communities to really advance projects in the places where they're needed the most.
Thanks, Kristen. Rosanna, would you like to speak to that?
Yeah, I am just so moved by that, Kristen. And I think it's making me remember something that I find so important. And just, in the course of my reporting, Orion does this too, with especially with this issue, just this notion of like recalibrating expertise and who we value as expert in these conversations, and beyond lawyers and scientists with peer-reviewed papers and historians and anthropologists with PhDs, and in my space, the science, who is wielding the science and the knowledge, and where does, for example, Indigenous knowledge fit into these conversations, and also like frontline communities and their lived experiences, even though they're not necessarily peer-reviewed data points. How do we center these anecdotes and their stories and their voices in this conversation that has largely ignored or overlooked their perspectives? And, in the Bay Area, as you're speaking, Kristen, I'm just thinking like there were just so many communities that I got to know, for example, where there was no data to back up the fact that they were suffering from health consequences of the ways we have disconnected and polluted so much of our environment, because no one had thought to look into it or to dedicate their research project to it. And because there was no data quantifying these problems, the policy priorities went elsewhere. And that's the definition of being overlooked, right? Like, how do you validate these other forms of knowledge and experience in a way that is also so core to the story? And I really was moved reading, through Orion's pieces, that we do center these perspectives in a way that isn't just grounded in the traditional, or maybe not traditional, old school forms of expertise. And, as like a working journalist, I am also constantly thinking about who we choose to quote and center, because when you quote someone, you give that person power. When you choose to center and listen to a story, you give that person's story power. And I think that in all the ways that we write about our environment and think about, rethink our relationship to water, I think it's also an opportunity to rethink how to redistribute that power in the way we engage and think about these issues.
Can I just speak to that for a moment as well? Thank you for these excellent thoughts. And I didn't really get a chance to write about it very much in the piece that I have in this particular piece, but I just want to give a shout out to, there's an organization here in Houston called West Street Recovery, and they work with a partner organization called the Northeast Action Collective. And one of the things that they've done that I really admire in the last several years is that they really do center and emphasize the expertise that flood victims, flood survivors have, and they have worked really closely. There's a number of reports that they have issued that you can find on their website that sort of trained flood survivors and community members to do sort of social science research, qualitative research, interviewing their neighbors, and helping to to do the sort of the research that sort of informed the policy that then they were recommending. And I really, really appreciate and admire that model, just in thinking about the expertise that many people have, but also in particular people who have been flooded, that they know a lot about flooding. And I really value the way that they have put that to work.
LACY, thank you so much for that. Thank all of you for your response to that question. And LACY, I want to stick with you for just a moment to dig a little bit deeper into this notion of historicizing flooding, because you do such a thoughtful, beautiful job of that in your essay. Why is it important to you that, we as thinkers, experts, writers, historicize contemporary flooding? And perhaps I should just add, to give that question some context for folks who have yet to read the issue. You start your beautiful essay about living through one of the more recent and worst floods in Houston's history. And then from there, you go on into the history of flooding in the area, in the region. So why is it important that we historicize, or perhaps put another way, what do we fail to realize if we don't historicize?
Yeah, thank you. So I am a fairly new, I mean, I've lived in Houston 15 years, 16 years, something like that. So quite a long time, but still, not forever. And I think when I came to Houston, like everyone seemed surprised every time it flooded, shocked even that it was flooding again, that there's a kind of amnesia here about flooding and our relationship to flooding. And one of the things I write about in this essay is the way in which that is blamed on the rivers, on the bayous themselves, that there's a problem with the way that the bayous function or the way they operate, that they're too natural or too wild, and they need to be controlled and constructed. They need to be channelized and encased in concrete and engineered so that they are human made and human controlled, and that may make them function better. Spoilers, that did not work out the way that they planned, and they actually flood more and function worse. But I think also historicizing made me realize that flooding is not new. Houston has always flooded. It was founded in 1836, and it flooded for the first time 13 months later. John James Audubon writes about, he came to visit, and he writes about how the bayous had overtaken the land. But part of what happens when we do that is we realize that this is in fact a natural process, that it's a little bit disingenuous to talk about flooding when we're describing a place that is a wetland, right? It's not a flood. It's not really a flood when a wetland fills with water. It's a natural process. It's an ecosystem doing what it is meant to do. And it becomes a flood only when we pave over a wetland, when we drain it and pave it and plow away the prairie grass that opened up the dense clay soil so that the land, in its sort of natural state, the prairie grasses open up those soils so that the land acts more like a sponge instead of the way it functions now, which is more like a bowl. And I think that taking that historical view allows us to see that this is not a given, that we can see, I guess, some of the choices and errors that were made, and perhaps some of what our pathway forward, what some of the possibilities for the future might be, how we can correct those errors that were our own, and sort of find ways to live more gently with the waterways that sustain us and give us life.
Thank you so much. KRISTAN and ROSANNA, I saw you both nodding emphatically through that response. Is there anything about historicizing rivers or other bodies of water that you would like to add to the conversation?
Yeah, really briefly. I mean, what LACY was just describing in Houston just resonates so much, and so much of what's happening in California. KRISTAN probably knows the stat better than I do, but I think more than 90% of our coastal wetlands along the outer California coast have been destroyed or altered or filled in or paved over for the sake of development. And it is just this idea, these in-between spaces too, between like true land and ocean, and what the land that we've tried to take from the ocean is fascinating to me. And just recognizing, what LACY was saying, this amnesia of like, oh my God, the water is here. It's not supposed to be here. And then you look at these historic maps and you're like, the Bay Area was, so much of it was a marsh, and that these marshes have gradients, and the difference between a mudflat and a salt marsh and a freshwater marsh. We've lost kind of so much of this magic in these in-between spaces. And LACY also writes beautifully in her piece about just like the aliveness of the bayou, and I really felt that. I think that aliveness has been hardened over in so many ways with concrete. In Los Angeles, the LA River is lined with concrete. The lack of sediment, going to the ocean is also affecting the way we can rebuild beaches, because again, all these systems are interconnected and the coastline is a process, not a static place. And I think the one last thing I'll note is just kind of bridging together some other threads from our conversation already. You know, as someone who's written a lot about these issues and sea level rise adaptation and all these things, like I feel like the word resilience really stumped me as a writer for so long. And as I'm like kind of, you know, and everyone's probably heard this term at this point, what does it mean to be like a resilient community or to build resilient infrastructure against sea level rise and flooding in the bayous? And, you know, for so long, the way we measure resilience is our ability to remain unchanged, right? Katrina levels New Orleans and we shall rebuild exactly what we lost in exactly the same place that we lost it. The way our insurance markets are historically set up is to basically give you your house back after you lose it in wildfire, and you get the same exact house in the same exact place. And we're not thinking about what it means to adapt. And so what does it mean to actually think through the transformations that need to happen and to take each of these disasters and opportunities as a way to rebuild more wisely and more thoughtfully? And I love what LACY just said, more gently in better relationship with the water. So those are kind of some of the through lines that I have been thinking a lot about in just like my whole realm of work. And with Orion, the piece I wrote for Orion, it was just really, I think the word resilience also kept popping up. Like, what does it actually mean to hold the line, and what are we actually holding the line against?
I'd love to follow up on that thought. And LACY and Rosanna, thank you both for your thoughts. LACY, what you said about just this collective amnesia around flooding is something that really resonated with me in California. Whenever natural disasters in California are in the national news and the national spotlight, we're usually talking about wildfires. We don't usually think about or talk about floods. But there are, many researchers, there's lots of science to indicate that this is something that should be top of mind for all of us. If folks are interested in learning more about the science, UCLA researcher Dr. Daniel Swain really works on mapping and predicting large mega floods in California, and has written a lot about this body of work. But it's something that we really need to not only think about, but prepare for and think about in terms of resilience, which is something that you touched on, Rosanna. And finally, I'd ideally, in an ideal world, I'd love for us to think about this as an opportunity to really restore rivers. And, obviously I'm biased working for a river restoration organization, river protection organization, but I really do believe that rivers present a lot of the solutions that are key to adapting to a warming world and a changing climate and a wetter Central Valley that floods. We need to allow room for rivers to flood. We need to make sure that we are building sensibly and allowing our cities to expand sensibly. And we also need to make sure that we have things like sustained public funding in order to fund things such as large long-term river restoration projects to really advance the pace and scale of how we restore rivers and where we can restore rivers as quickly as possible. Because this is the key, these are what we call multi-benefit projects. They help groundwater be replenished. By allowing rivers to flood, we're creating open space where people can escape the heat in their cities. As well as creating, oases that are cool places where people can cool off within their cities along urban creeks. And we're really, frankly, creating a place for people to just find renewal when there is so much climate grief and climate anxiety that we're all feeling, either consciously or subconsciously. So I really do believe that rivers are the solution, are a solution at least, to helping us adapt.
Thanks so much for that, Kristen. Rosanna, I want to come back to you for a moment because you mentioned your essay. And I have a question about a specific line or lines that you wrote. Towards the end of your powerful piece, and for again, for folks who haven't read it yet, her piece in sum is about visiting a failing seawall. You write, I saw those cracks, cracks in the very foundations of what we once considered immovable, cracks we can no longer ignore. In your many years of reporting on coastal disasters, what are the cracks that we can no longer ignore?
Oh my goodness, that is a great question. And so I will just say out the gate that this was the hardest piece I have ever had to write. And I think in like 1,000 word news reports, and the book was really obviously hard to write. But so Orion reached out and asked me to write, Sumant and Tara, really wonderful editors, asked me to write a 400-word essay for the Climate Diary series. And I love the prompt, and Tara was such a great editor to work with, like this notion of bearing witness to small details and more quiet moments of horror. The format of a full-length essay almost, inevitably makes the writer have to expand their scope of thinking. And I also tend to write big and broad and deep. And so to refocus my lens on these smaller details was such an interesting and challenging thought exercise for me as a writer. And, I spent months, I'm going to admit, with this piece, like flipping back through so many of my notebooks over the years, from disasters, from like, oh, how about this place, or that interview with that person. And I did find throughout my own notes this like quiet through line of all of the details that I jotted down that helped me remember how I felt in the moment. And it was there calling out to me, and just like as I was processing what I was seeing on these larger scales. And with the cracks, it was like the cracks in my own reporting and knowledge of processing and thinking through kind of what it is that we are already experiencing and changing it from something that we are anticipating or fearing from the future. And also kind of reconciling the things that we have glossed over or overlooked or chose not to look at from the past, and kind of stitching it all together. And it can go in so many directions, but just this amnesia that LACY spoke to, I think the sun comes out every time after floods in Los Angeles, in California, in Houston. And it is so easy to move on and to write these instances off as like one-off events that won't happen again. Again, this idea that we are holding on to what we are familiar to, and also just kind of framing these conversations in a way, like, for me, like talking about adapting to sea level rise, facing the ocean, battling sea level rise, all these analogies of war against nature and controlling nature. Ultimately, there is this fear of loss that I feel so much in all of the conversations I have with folks. And then I remember my book editor posing to me early on in like our book writing process, what is the difference between loss and change? And I think that by reshifting that conversation and question, and just the way I explored a lot of these things, you do start to see these cracks in our own understanding of what it means to live with water, what it means to process our fear of loss. And ultimately, what KRISTAN said, turning these conversations of like what it is that we have to hold on to and what it is at stake to opportunities to rebuild and to more wisely, more gently, and more sustainably and to free rivers and to free kind of these systems that we have trapped and and siloed in all these different spaces. So I think for me, it was seeing the big picture, also recognizing again that there's with 400 words, you have to be concise in newspaper writing, and because of a word count, and I feel like every word ends up mattering and it leads to this kind of precise way of writing. And with 400 words for a short essay for Orion, I felt like I had a conversation with every single word in this piece, because I was like, do you belong here? Are you going to remain? And I think that I feel like I can go on for an hour about every single word that I ended up choosing for this piece, and just thank you for the opportunity to stretch my writing in this way.
Well, Rosanna, thank you for your lovely and profound contribution to the issue. The way that you said that you were in conversation with every single word is a great transition into a question that I have for all three of you, because all three of you are remarkable, wildly talented communicators. And so I know you're all thinking about not just the words that you use, but the emotions that you imbue into them. So, in your experience, what emotions on the wide range that humans can feel, from fear and despair to hope and optimism and everything in between, what have you found to be the most effective in generating greater awareness and, with any luck, mobilizing some action to care more about the climate crisis and the myriad concerns we're discussing today? What are those emotions that are the most effective?
I don't know that I can, I don't have a perspective on what the effect is of what I write, right? It's hard to see. There's no necessarily, like, what are the metrics or how do you measure that? I don't necessarily have any sense of that, but I know, the stories and narratives that I experience from, other things that I read or the people that I talk to, the sources. And I think one of the things that I find most moving, or most, I guess that makes me feel most determined, actually, is this sort of sense of people knowing the odds that they are up against, having full awareness that, there's not any such thing as a perfect restoration, for example. There are, even if we do everything exactly right, take every step, there are some things that, there will be harm, there will be pain, there will be devastating loss. And yet they do the work anyway, right? And just sort of pick it up and keep working. And this isn't necessarily related to rivers, but it's something that related to something else that I've been working on. I've been writing a lot about restoration lately, and I went last summer and visited a prairie restoration here in town at Sheldon Lake State Park. And there's a group of people there working to restore the prairie that had been plowed and many times over, so that the prairie had been damaged. And, everybody is aware that, we cannot put it back. Like, what has been lost will never be recovered. And also they're aware that the timeline on which you are working toward something that is functioning as a healthy ecosystem of a restoration is decades, centuries, millennia. Like, it is a really, really long timeline. And yet they know that they are, like, that work that they are doing right now is still essential to that longer timeline, that they sort of feel themselves as a piece in the puzzle moving us into the future, that the work that they are doing is making more futures possible, right? Rather than sort of foreclosing the possible futures into one that's catastrophic and disastrous. And so one of the things that I feel like is my role as a climate communicator then or an environmental communicator, is to help to narrate those motivations, to help to narrate the stakes, I guess, in what they're doing and their motivations for doing it. All the complicated, the historical, the present, the emotional, bringing all of those things together so that the weight of our current action is clear and that we can feel it, and that we sort of lift that weight, I guess, more or less together.
Rosanna or Kristen, any thoughts on emotions? And if not, that's okay too.
Well, yeah, I can chime in. I didn't know if Kristen had anything she wanted to say.
I'll go after you. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, yeah, I was just, I loved, Amy, the way you framed kind of the spectrum, right? Like hope versus despair. That's something that I have been wrestling with a lot as a, environmental journalist. I think if you put 10 climate reporters in a room to talk about what that right balance is, you'll get like more than 10 answers. And I think a lot of folks, in this space think that anger is an activating emotion. I personally have kind of strayed away from that, but there are definitely studies and folks who will tell you that anger is a spark, and but then it's like, what do you do after that spark is another kind of set of emotions that you have to unpack. For me, I have a personal rule where I don't want to write anything that just tells people the sky is falling without giving them some sense of hope. But if you give someone too much hope, they're able to put that article down and move on to the next thing and not think about it. If you give someone not enough hope, there is that paralysis and grief and inaction that you're starting to see in so many different ways manifesting in the conversations and just people's lived lives. And so that dynamic of hope versus despair really bothered me, and I struggled with it so much for years in my writing. And I just realized that outside of all of that, the emotion that has grounded me the most is the sense of duty. Does the reader feel a sense of responsibility after reading any of my articles, my essays, my book? Does the reader feel a sense of duty to do something? And that do something isn't to fix sea level rise. It's to have a conversation with your neighbor, to continue thinking about it, to be committed to not look away from these cracks in the foundations of our entire world as we know it, to not look away from the last flood until the next one hits. And that responsibility takes courage. I think, courage for me has been a really, really powerful emotion to explore in, the course of my writing. And I think we need to acknowledge the grief. I saw that come in the chat too. We're all feeling it. We don't necessarily use the same words to describe it, but that sense of grief and anxiety in some ways, that the world is changing, but that change doesn't have to be scary. And that's when you need more guides and more people to be in conversation with. And ultimately, how do we make people feel not alone in what they're feeling? So this is kind of a unstructured thought, but clearly it's a constant continuum for me too, of how much hope I have and courage and responsibility. But those are some of the emotions that I have been navigating lately. And I think it's really helped me deepen my own way of thinking about a lot of these issues.
All of those, Lacey and Rosanna, all of those emotions and thoughts that you presented really resonate with me, kind of finding a middle point and a way forward when you're oscillating between grief and hope. And Rosanna, what you said about anger activating you and sustaining the action that stems from that, the results from that in a way that's healthy and sustainable. I would offer radical love and joy and compassion. And as someone who comes from a science background, curiosity. A climate activist and scientist that I admire, Dr. Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson, she often asks the question, I actually think this is the name of her upcoming book that's coming out this year. What if we get it right? Can we be curious about dreaming up a new world where we get things right? What if we restored our rivers to address these issues around flooding and environmental justice and urban heat islands and heat waves and groundwater wells growing dry? And what if we actually get it right and we find a place where we are in a resilient world that can weather the perils and the danger that comes from a warming world? And that kind of space for radical imagination and curiosity around, things big and small, and trying to find the beauty in things, that activates me. And I offer that as a middle point for you, if any of you on this call are struggling with climate anxiety. For me, it's, asking questions like that and grounding myself like that. It feels neutral in that it's not, pretending that things are going to be completely okay or trying to put on a brave face of happiness, but just asking questions and forcing myself to stop and think and dream about possibility. It helps, it really centers me and grounds me. And as far as joy, I mean, it's not all doom and gloom to work in this field and to restore rivers. One of my colleagues, actually several of my colleagues, are really good at trying to inspire each other to celebrate our wins and the successful projects and community partnerships that we're able to form out of restoring rivers and creeks and mountain meadows that feed the main California waterways downstream. And that is a place where we can just kind of experience joy and celebration together. And I think that's really important too, just making space for joy and happiness when it is there and when it is kind of front of mind for everyone.
Kristen, thank you. On that inspiring note, I want to try to get to as many of the questions in the Q&A box as we can. There are so many, and thanks to those of you who have been dropping the questions. I'm going to combine a couple here. One of the questions comes from Holly, who it sounds like Holly is in Florida and writes that there's a catastrophic situation in Florida that suffers from the politics of development with no end in sight. The first question from Holly is for all of you, which is, can you suggest some organizations that you think people should support or who are assisting in finding solutions for the future? And then the other question is specifically for you, Kristen. What other organizations does American Rivers work with in your work?
Sure. Should I just go ahead and jump in?
Yeah, go for it. Go for it.
Okay. Well, with regards to work in Florida, I primarily work in California in the Central Valley, so I'll do my best. I would direct you to American Rivers website, so that's www.americanrivers.org, to see how you can connect with folks working in our Southeast region, and we can assist with connecting you with local organizations who can really, try to help. With regards to Amy, I'm sorry, can you repeat your second question?
Yeah, other organizations, and this is for everybody, that you think people attending today should look into and try to support.
Sure. Well, we do have organizations that we try to highlight through campaigns such as our this year's Most Endangered Rivers campaign, which is also available on our website, americanrivers.org. And that is a fantastic campaign where we've tried to highlight 10 of America's most endangered rivers as really championed by local community partners who are working on the ground to protect their rivers and to get their rivers over a crucial kind of decision-making point where people have the opportunity to really contribute on the ground support to protect those rivers. So for example, I'm thinking of Umar de Colores and Surfrider Foundation down in San Diego, who are working tirelessly on the Tijuana River to really address the really over a century of pollution and dumping and water quality crises and frankly an environmental justice crisis at the US-Mexico border down in Imperial Beach and San Diego. So that's just two of the many, many organizations we work with. I work with organizations such as Restore the Delta in the Delta. I work with cities and agencies such as City of Oakley and others who are just, bring all kinds of really wonderful perspectives that folks, again, can check out on the American Rivers website.
Hey, shall we move on to another question? Let's get to some more. We have a few here that are related to the economics of flooding. So I'm going to do my best to combine them. We have one question here from Melissa who says that after losing their own home to flooding, went back to study geography and planning and learned that many people who live in high-risk flooding areas are there because they have low incomes, and those are the only properties that allow them the possibility of owning a home. Someone else also talks about the high cost of insurance to live there, and what is also preventing some people from selling their homes. So I open up the question to all three of you. Any way in that you'd like to answer the economics of living in a flood zone?
I think, and I mean, I can really mainly speak to the Houston context here. But one of the things that has become clear in my work on flooding here, you know, and I started working on flooding, or reading and thinking and writing about flooding mainly after Hurricane Harvey, which is, I guess, 7 years ago now. But in the process of working on our book, More City Than Water, you know, this became very clear, this issue of racial and economic disparity around issues of flooding. You know, in Houston in particular, it was clear that communities that flood, as you say, are, I mean, they function in the same way that many different kinds of sacrifice zones do. They're often, the populations of residents are lower income. They're more often people of color. They're more often disenfranchised in other kinds of ways. And I think some of that has to do actually with the legislation around flooding that we have operating in this country. Most flood mitigation projects are evaluated, especially if they have any kind of federal funding, based on the Flood Control Act of, was it 1936, which says that, which, you know, almost 100 years old, this legislation now. But it evaluates projects based on the economic value of the land that will be protected, rather than the number of people that the project will protect. So the consequence in Houston is that wealthy neighborhoods almost never flood, and poor neighborhoods almost always do. All the flood mitigation projects that have happened here have benefited those wealthier, more affluent neighborhoods, whereas neighborhoods that are more economically disenfranchised, they have not had a flooding mitigation project in decades. And, you know, in wealthier neighborhoods, there are, you know, vast systems of pipelines underneath the surface of the city that carry water away from the neighborhoods and back towards the bayous. And the flood infrastructure in these poor neighborhoods is often just a sort of 3-foot ditch that's between the house and the road. And that the responsibility for maintaining that ditch is on the homeowner. So I think, you know, this is something to be aware of. And also the legislation here in Texas is that anyone who, like, you don't have to disclose if your home has flooded in the past. If you're buying a home, you have to ask about it at closing to find out if it has flooded, and they are legally obligated to tell you, but only at closing. And renters are never, landlords are never obligated to disclose, though I think that there may have been a law that changed that very recently. But all of this is to say, you know, it's increasingly hard if you live in a flood zone to get flood insurance. It's very expensive to live outside of a place that doesn't flood. And again, the sort of question that I'm thinking about and that I try to grapple with is, like, are these neighborhoods more expensive because they do not flood, or do they not flood because they are more expensive neighborhoods? And I think the answer is both, right? That those things are entangled. But again, I encourage people to just sort of join up with your local organizations. If you live in a place that floods, there are likely organizations that are advocating for change on that behalf, and that you don't necessarily have to find the answers and create all the solutions on your own. You can join up with the work of people who have been at this and have some solutions, and they will just sort of appreciate your help and support in that. Here in Houston, you know, that's again the West Street Recovery Group, the Northeast Action Collective, and we have also a wonderful organization called Bayou City Waterkeepers that is helping to restore healthy waterways.
Great. a quick question about rivers specifically. So Kristen, feel free to jump in here. This attendee is from Maine and is wondering if you have information to share, not only about the health of rivers, but how specifically healthy flowing rivers contribute to restoring ecological systems.
That is a great question. Thank you. I would first definitely please check out our website at americansrivers.org. We have so many great graphics and information and really fantastic videos that have more information. The question was how rivers restore ecological function, how we can restore ecological function. Rivers, as I mentioned earlier in our conversation, when we restore rivers, they produce a whole host of benefits to the ecology and groundwater and wildlife and things like that. So some benefits that you can see that happened right after we complete a restoration project, for example, where we've gone and planted things like native plants and removed things like the cement encasing of a channelized river. So, transforming something that looked like the LA River into something that looks more like a natural riparian forest that's beautiful, where water is flowing and that's populated by native plants and flora and things like that. There's wildlife habitat that we're able to create that creates a home for birds and fish and beavers and all kinds of native animals. As we allow rivers to move within their what we call floodplain, their natural floodplain, it helps reestablish the natural conditions that support native plants and allow them to grow. And we're able to see species come back and return, sometimes within years, just a couple of years, sometimes even months after, completing a restoration project. If I can offer an example of this, we're seeing that now with the Klamath River projects as the dams are coming down. There have been 4 dams that are either in the process of being removed or have been removed. And there's also a massive, massive effort that American Rivers is involved in to coordinate all kinds of different parties and tribal partners to start the massive effort of replanting native plants and restoring the river valley so that it looks like the way it did before these dams were built. And we're already starting to see fish returning, birds, native species, and native plants. And it's really quite remarkable. We're literally seeing the river become revitalized and revived as these dams are coming down. So yeah, very, very inspiring. Rivers are resilient.
Thank you so much for that, Kristen. We are right at 2, but I am going to try to sneak in one more question because there is so much gratitude in the Q&A box here for the 3 of you, for Orion. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Lots of folks who were inspired by your thoughts on emotions, yours in particular, Rosanna, you get a shout out. So my last question for each of you briefly is, what gives you hope or optimism for the future? And Lacey, can I pick on you to go first?
What gives me hope? I think, as Kristen was just saying in your really excellent response there, that I think the bayous and rivers themselves gives me hope when you see a restoration project and you see these ecosystems becoming more healthy and wildlife returning and the different flowers growing and things sort of taking on its process, a self-sustaining process. I think that itself gives me hope. I think, again, because I live here in Houston and And there's so much sort of industrial harm. You know, we're energy capital of the world. I think I tend to feel somewhat despairing, like, oh, it's never going to be good. It's always going to be ruined. But when you give this sort of loving attention to the rivers, to these ecosystems, you see that they respond. And I think that that gives me hope that there is a healthy future ahead of us.
I'll jump in really quickly. This conversation gives me hope. I mean, just the number of communities and spaces that I've been in conversation with, for example, since my book came out a couple months ago, and just kind of recognizing, I mean, I've been writing about climate now for more than 10, 15 years, and it's just the level of engagement has truly become profound, and the number of artists and thinkers, and just like it's no longer a conversation based in science, and I think and policy, and whether or not you believe the science or not. And I think that just the threads that have emerged from this conversation alone, and just the fact that there are like 200 people on this call is just super inspiring and hopeful for me. And I guess I'm gonna just kick it back to Ty had a really great question in the Q&A, and I'll just acknowledge it briefly. Just the question of like, where does the writer sit in this continuum of hope and despair, and like the emotions? And I think for me, I'll just speak to the experience of writing the book. I felt like I ended up as the writer and the through line, like absorbing everyone's emotions, everyone's grief, everyone's hope, everyone's love for the ocean. And the thing that actually gave me hope is that there was more commonality than differences when I spoke to folks, even like the hardcore folks on this end, and everyone here telling me, oh, don't talk to that guy. He's a climate denier. He's never going to want to blah, blah, blah. He's so angry at the meetings. You know, I knock on his door, and he also loves the ocean. He also chose to live here in this community, and he was too busy saving monarch butterflies to answer my phone call. And that's why I had to knock on his door. And I think kind of reconnecting with the humanity that we all share, and seeing it, recognizing it, you know. And my book editor told me, like, my book ultimately felt like a really profound exercise in radical listening, you know, to build on KRISTAN's point on radical imagination. I think the more we listen to each other, and the fact that this listening is starting to happen, the fact that we are no longer, you know, sitting alone in our own thoughts and feelings about this, and that we are coalescing and joining community, like all of that truly gives me hope, and we need more of it. And so, you know, to answer other questions that have been popping in the Q&A, you know, one big thing I would encourage all of you to do is just to join something bigger than yourself. That's something I think Bill McKibben said beautifully once. That's a great first step, a really powerful first step, and to recognize that no one alone can solve these issues that are truly systemic in nature, but we are all part of the system, and together we can transcend a lot of these problems.
Well, I'll jump in. I am incredibly inspired by the grassroots activism and movement building that I see. You know, I'm thinking about, Rosanna, you'd mentioned the Los Angeles River. It's my understanding that the first folks who were, you know, really trying to think big about, you know, can we revitalize, can we restore the LA River? They were artists. They were just artists from Los Angeles. It was an art project. And that's where the Friends of the LA River organization came out of. And I think that's wonderful. In my hometown, shout out to Riverside, California, in the Inland Empire. Yeah, the Santa Ana River was protected by the work of 3 stay-at-home moms, housewives in the 1950s and 1960s, who were out there, and they saw the LA River being channelized and the effects that it had on communities, and said, no, we don't want that to happen in our backyard. And that is why the Santa Ana River, the stretch that extends through Riverside, it still looks like a soft bottom channel that hosts native wildlife, plants, and it's beautiful. And you know, I'm so inspired to see those kinds of movements blossom and become big and become centered in our conversations around restoring rivers and climate and addressing environmental injustices. I think that's really, really inspiring. I also want to give a shout out and say that I am very inspired by seeing the next generation of youth who are absolutely just completely inspiring to me. I'm a millennial and I see Gen Z, and I think they're all role models of mine. To just see them be loud and active and passionate, that gives me hope. That lights a fire under me and inspires me to wake up in the morning and do what I do. So very hopeful.
Thank you, Kristen and Rosanna and Lacey. We are unfortunately out of time. We are past time, but I am so full of gratitude for all three of you. Thank you for supporting Orion. Kristen, thank you and American Rivers for your wonderful partnership. And thank you to all the attendees for taking time out of your day to join us for this important conversation. You will, for those of you who attended, you will be receiving either later today or tomorrow at latest an email with a link to a recording of this event. We'll also include in that email a link to subscribe to Orion at 20% off. So please do take advantage of that. And if you are already a subscriber, then that will apply to a renewal when it's time to be renewed. Please take advantage of the free 1-year membership to American Rivers. And we will also include links to purchase Rosanna and Lacey's most recent books, so you can continue to, soak in their brains. So to everyone, thank you again. Be well and enjoy the rest of your day. Take care.